called to become a member of the Catholic Church.
Love the Catholic Church. It's just the best place to be.
From the studios of EWTN, this is Open Line. In North America, call toll-free 1-800-585-9396. That's 1-800-585-9396. Outside North America, call 1-205-271-2985. You can also send an email to openline@ewtn.com.
Well, good afternoon. It's Friday again, and here we are on the Friday edition of Open Line. I'm flying today without Jack, our usual trusty moderator on Fridays and the other days of Open Line as well. He's off today, and so I'll be doing this by myself, which means I have to read you the numbers and tell you all the things you have to do to get in touch with us to ask your questions. So if you're in the United States or in Canada, in other words, North America, you can call us at 1-800-585-9396. That's 800-585-9396. Or if you're outside North America, you can call us at country code 1-205-271-2985. That's country code 1-205-271-2985. We also have this new texting possibility. You can text EWTN to 55000. Then you will get a response, and then you text in your first name and your question. So you can submit questions by email to our Open Line email, and you can also by text, and of course you can call and ask it directly of me. So we're getting down to the wire on voting, and I know that a lot of people are concerned and thinking about how to vote and what's possible, who it's possible to vote for. And so those kinds of questions are welcome. We want to try to clarify in people's minds the teachings of the Church on this issue, because frankly, there is a good deal of nonsense out there about the teaching of the Church. The Church, although you're not finding a lot of detail in something like the Catechism or the Compendium of the Social Teaching of the Church, there is a tradition on the voting in democracies, which is a historically rather new phenomena, but nonetheless, there is a tradition that tells us how we are to vote. And the first principle of voting is the common good of society. It's not voting like on American Idol, where you get to vote for somebody you like that person. They've got a great voice. They have a great disposition and temperament. They may have all of those things, and yet in the case of a candidate, that is not the most characteristic issue. The most important issue is how they stand in relationship to the common good. And the Church teaches us, as Pope Benedict certainly did, that in that respect there are non-negotiable common goods, such as life, natural marriage and family life, which should be protected and fostered by the state. And there is also the question of freedom, especially religious freedom, since to follow our religious conscience is a natural human right, as is the natural human right to life, and the natural human right to have marriage and family and to come as a child, as a new human being from two parents, male and female, and develop and grow and mature to fit into the larger society through that family. These are the issues which are most important in an election, because the common good is the good of all. We've had various kinds of candidates over the year with various individual personal moral problems, but the concern of the voter is to advance the common good, not to feel comfortable necessarily with their vote, not to be happy within their skin emotionally with their vote, but to choose rightly, correctly, and in accordance with a formed conscience, to choose an individual who will advance the common good, especially on the non-negotiable issues of life, marriage and family life, and religious freedom, as opposed to those who would detract or be a detriment or disserve or even cause those values to decline in society. So there is the crux or the nub of the issue, and so we need to always keep that in mind. So I think, as we get into the question of voting, certainly I'll take your calls on that. And while I'm waiting for callers, let me take a question from Alex, who asks, Paul confronted Peter regarding his not wanting to be around Gentiles. If Peter was our first pope, how is it that Paul is able to correct Peter? Is not the pope infallible? Well, yes, the pope is infallible on certain occasions. He's certainly infallible when he teaches what is already the doctrine of the church on Christ, the Trinity, the Incarnation, the sacraments, the nature of authority in the church, and so on. These are clearly areas where he's teaching in unity with what has been taught before, been declared to be true by the church, and therefore it is he's simply repeating those. But if he wishes to advance the development of doctrine, then he does so typically in a solemn way or by confirming opinions that are already present in the common theology of the church. And of course, this he is certainly free to do. In the case of Peter and Paul, what was being corrected? The moral behavior of the Pope. The Pope is not impeccable. He's not conceived without original sin, and therefore he's capable of sin. He's capable of imprudences. Peter was being imprudent. An apostle, somebody who at least as an apostle had stature and had in that sense a right and also a responsibility to correct Peter regarding his behavior, did so. There was no affront to the infallibility of the Pope. The Pope wasn't declaring anything infallibly. And so he was acting actually contrary to what he knew to be the best moral disposition, and that is to treat Jewish converts and Gentile converts alike as members of the same body of Christ. And that he did not do. And so this is why Paul rebuked him. So there's no offense there against the infallibility of the Pope. Well, we have the calls coming in, and we've got Larkin in Seattle and Andrew in Texas and Mel out in California waiting on the lines. And so as soon as we get back from this break, we're going to go to Larkin in Seattle. So if you haven't started to call in, do so now. Our number is 1-800-585-9396, 800-585-9396, or you can text us at EWTN 55000.
60 on 10 with Monsignor Charles Pope.
The second commandment, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. The disclosure of a name in the ancient world belonged to the order of trust and intimacy. And so when God revealed his name to Moses, it was an extraordinary outreach to us, saying that we were called to an intimate, trusting relationship with him. And so we should always reverence this name as a great, great gift. We should obviously never use God's name to curse or to blaspheme or to berate others. That's wholly inappropriate. God's name is meant to bring blessing. And likewise, the vain use. Vain means empty. And so some of these expressions like, oh my God, or, and so on, need to be avoided as well. Vain means empty, and those are using God's name as an empty kind of expression of exasperation. And then finally, never ever to use God's name to swear an oath falsely. The second commandment, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain.
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.
The National Catholic Register is America's most complete Catholic news source, with a comprehensive view of the world from a distinctly Catholic perspective. For the latest issues, people, and events shaping the world as we know it, visit ncregister.com.
Augustine Institute Radio Theater presents Brother Francis, the Barefoot Saint of Assisi.
The entire town talks about Francis, They ask me directly about him in the marketplace, at church, over a meal. Or they'll whisper behind my back. I see the looks of pity or the knowing smiles. I'm his mother, so you can imagine how that makes me feel.
Brother Francis, the Barefoot Saint of Assisi, this Sunday night, 9 Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Hello, this is Father John Paul Mary.
This is Debbie Georgiani, co-host of Take Two with Jerry and Debbie.
My friends, this is Bishop Kevin Vann of the Diocese of Orange. I want to thank you very much for listening to the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
This is Open Line on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. If you have a question or comment, call 1-800-585-9396. Outside North America, call 1-205-271-2985 or send an email to openline@ewtn.com.
Okay, we're back, and let's go first to Mel in California watching us on YouTube. Good afternoon, Mel.
Hi. I'm calling because I have a deep concern with regards to my parents. I grew up in a Catholic family. My parents baptized me. They gave me the formation and catechism and everything, and I received the sacrament of confirmation. And as an adult, when I was away from home, my parents got a divorce. And I'm back home again, and my father has left the church and is married to another woman. My mother is still in the church. She's not getting married again. She's celibate. How does a person in a family that grew up in a Catholic family and now is encountering division in faith among their own parents because there's a divorce and there's a remarrying, and how do you bring them back home?
Well, I mean, there is of course no infallible means. There's unfortunately, no technique that can do it because everybody is so individual. The reasons your father left and so on, like in many cases, yours would be a very common story, I suspect, across our country. We're all creatures of the culture, and in one way or another, even the best of us would find ourselves probably different from people of other cultures and other times who we would be just as Catholic as, but yet we have certain habits and things which are a fruit of the way our times are. And I think you can only go at it. Obviously, we have with a parent, we have an obligation to respect them and show a special honor to them, even in their being wrong. I'm always reminded of the son of Noah, who, when he encountered his father drunk and naked after, you might say, the invention of wine, rather than shaming him by covering him up while looking at him, he held the cloak behind him and he backed up and laid it over him too. Now, we would think that would be an extreme of showing honor and respect, but I think it's giving us a lesson, the degree that even an adult child to an adult father, who in this case unwittingly, the fruit of the grape produced a result he probably wasn't aware would happen. And I think often our parents who fall into those situations are the same way, as would be a child who leaves home with the faith and suddenly is losing it. They get into the culture and things happen, and unwittingly they lose it, or they begin to walk away and it cools and then it's gone. There has to be reasons there. I would say just talk about it with him. Dad, why... you and Mom just gave me such a good upbringing. What is it that, led you to leave the church? Was it one of her teachings? Was it, your own marriages you had to... What is it exactly? And try to get at it and be patient, because after all, God loves him too and wants him back more than you do. And so you can be patient. You can do what you can in one moment, do what you can in another. Pray, do a lot of praying, of course, on your own, and then over time, hopefully, your dialogue. This is what Pope Francis, when he's talking about showing mercy to others, is really talking about. When he talks about accompaniment, he's talking to priests about accompanying those in marriage situations of divorce and remarriage and so on. But this could apply to us too. If we have a friend in that situation, if we have a parent, or if we have a child in that situation, to accompany them, to not lord it over them, not to expect that we, with our sound intellectual reasons, can in an instant produce a conversion, not to abandon the belief that God is working too, and grace and other opportunities will have an impact on, but in the moment to do what we can and leave it and pray, and then maybe another moment will come. And I think it's patience, it's accompaniment, and that will work you're a priest in a parish, or if you're a parent, or if you're a child or a colleague or friend. And that's what I would suggest.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. You're welcome. Well, let's quickly take an email question. Paul asks, my Catholic cousin will be married next year in a non-denominational church. My concern is, where does that put her in standing with the Catholic Church after this happens? Shall I attend it? Will I be stating my concern with her decisions, or I will be stating my concerns with her decisions soon? From the Church's point of view, that marriage will not be valid. So you really should not attend it. I think you have to make clear to her. First of all, I would ascertain if she knows that she has an obligation to get permission to do that. She could probably get permission to marry before a minister of another denomination. It happens all the time. But she needs to go to her own pastor and through him get the bishop's permission to marry in that context. Then that minister, non-Catholic though it may be, can receive the vows. After all, it's the couple themselves that are marrying each other in the doctrine of the Church. They are the ministers of the sacrament to each other, and then there is somebody who receives it, and this non-Catholic minister or representative can be facultated by the Catholic bishop to do that so that the marriage is recognized. So I would start by seeing if she knows the law, if she understands why this is, that the Church is trying to protect the dignity of the sacrament and making sure that Catholics understand that Catholics are prepared to marry validly, which means observing the respect for unity in life that ought to be in every marriage. There's no divorce. Granted, things happen, but you don't go into it thinking can always divorce. You don't go into it thinking it no children. People have to know that unity and being open to life is part of marriage. And so the Church assures that by essentially requiring certain things for those getting married. But they can be dispensed from the formalities of marrying before a Catholic priest or a deacon for other circumstances. And that's all that is needed for her to marry in that context. So find out where she's at on that. And if her thought is to simply, blow off this obligation, then I think you have to say, well, you are following your conscience. I have to follow mine. And I can't participate in your, marriage if you are not going to marry validly. It won't be a marriage. That may present some difficulties, but that's the honest thing to do. So, Paul, that's what I would recommend first discovering her situation more exactly, and then that gives you a better idea where to go from there. Well, let's go on to our next caller, and we've got Larkin in Seattle listening on Sacred Heart Radio. Good afternoon, Larkin.
Good afternoon, Colin. I'm calling kind of with a comment. I've been following the Church's activities, and they seem to focus a lot on abortion, which I'm very glad that they do. It's a horrible thing. And also on what they call same-sex marriage. But what I don't hear the Church doing, or like EWTN or other kind of the bishops, I don't really see an emphasis on the poor. And I think it's important that Christ made that point that one of the most direct ways into heaven is to care for the poor and the sick, the imprisoned, the naked, the homeless, and so forth. So I was just wondering if you could give me any suggestions as to how I might get that agenda higher than abortion and same-sex marriage, because it chews up a lot of time. They both do, and I don't see the poor getting the same kind of attention.
Well, that may be true in some contexts. It's been my experience in being in parishes all over the country that there is a great deal of emphasis on the poor. Parishes cooperate in social services, delivering services to the poor through soup kitchen kinds of ministry. In fact, when I lived in Seattle, there was a deacon at the parish I was at that actually went down to First Avenue in Seattle, and this was the time there was a great number of street kids, that would live there. They were up from California, wherever they came from. So I think in my experience in parishes is there is always ministries involved in doing that. The diocese typically, because they have more resources, tend to be the ones do that through Catholic Charities. So they have they'll have pro-life related services. They'll have services to the poor. They'll have, as we have here in Birmingham, they will have an outreach in the poor neighborhoods to provide clothing and other items, things needed by pregnant women, care for children and families, and so on and so forth. And so those things are there. They're not necessarily being preached about. That's certainly true. But the Gospels themselves have a good deal of that, so it would be hard not through the course of any particular year for a homily to be at one time or another on preferential option for the poor, which is the way the church teaches that. We do that by representing those kinds of ministries and apostolates regularly in programming on EWTN. And so that's particular to what we do as an apostolate. And I think parish priests can certainly use the homily as an occasion to emphasize that. But let's look at this in the proper understanding. The services and the giving to the poor do not get us into heaven. That's one mistaken idea that you represented in your question. We don't get into heaven. We get into heaven by faith in Jesus Christ, which we are living, and faith, hope, and charity work within us. This we receive at baptism. We retain those, and they are operative in us, which means we have a disposition to help the poor, help our neighbor, to help others in the workplace and other situations. That's the activity of God within us, but which we cooperate in charity. And certainly helping the poor is an expression of that, as for instance in the Gospel of Matthew, where we're actually told by our Lord, not as an exclusive thing certainly, that we will be measured by what we do to the least of his people, what we do to the least. Or the poorest of the poor, in the words of Blessed Teresa, St. Teresa. So this is certainly a thing. Some of the other issues are much more serious for this reason. The poor have life. Poor children in poor families have a family. Abortion cuts at the heart of the good of man. It is the first right. The church rightly puts a certain emphasis on abortion. Not necessarily in homilies, because, again, the homily is supposed to be about the scriptures, so it may not come up there. But certainly every diocese has some pro-life apostolate that makes its own business, just as it has apostolates for the sick and for the poor and different groups for orphans and in hospitals and so on. So all of these needs are trying to be met. But there is a certain reason why on the moral issues abortion is so important. They're equally important in one sense that, yes, if we deprive widows and orphans, that's a crime that cries out to heaven for vengeance, according to the scriptures. Also, if we kill the innocent, abortion, euthanasia, that's mass murder. Any kind of murder. Those are crimes that Scripture tells us calls out to heaven for vengeance. Or if we're involved in a lifestyle, not just same-sex, but any lifestyle, but especially sodomy is mentioned in Scripture specifically, this is a crime that calls out to God for vengeance because it's a perversion at the root of society. Abortion is a perversion and an attack radically on life. Euthanasia, likewise. Embryonic stem cell research, likewise. In vitro fertilization, despite the good intentions, many are killed, likewise. On that scale, we're talking about the roots of a society, and likewise with marriage. Good natural marriages, if they don't flourish and are fostered by the state, the society will be corrupted from the ground up. That's why they're front and center on the moral scale, if perhaps not on the social services scale.
60 Seconds with Father Mitch Pacwa.
We teach because the Scripture teaches it in Hebrews 7, 8, and 9 that Jesus died once and for all. And therefore, we believe that Jesus himself has that one saving act of his death on the cross and his glorious resurrection from the dead at the center of each sacrament. It's not that we kill Christ again and again. It's rather that infinite act of Jesus dying on the cross and rising from the dead is made present by him and his Holy Spirit at the Mass and the other sacraments, and that it is Christ who is baptizing. That's why I don't say, may Jesus baptize you. I don't say that. I say, I baptize you. I'm speaking for Jesus. I don't say, this is his body, or this is your body. No, I say, this is my body. I speak for Jesus. It's not about us. It's about focusing on Jesus.
The people you know and trust are on EWTN.
From EWTN News Nightly in Washington, D.C., I'm Wyatt Goolsby with an EWTN News Link. Presidential candidates Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton shared the stage again last night at the annual Al Smith dinner in New York. In keeping with tradition, the candidates poked fun at each other, but some of Trump's jokes drew boos from the white tie crowd. Day 2 of the ceasefire in Aleppo provides relief from fighting, but many residents refuse to evacuate along the humanitarian corridors because they're not convinced it's safe. The Vatican hopes to formally reopen talks with the Sunni Muslim Center of Learning after a 5-year lapse. Vatican delegates will travel to Cairo this weekend to begin preparations. Formal talks are expected to begin in April. Visitors to Rome can now get a rare look into the Pope's summer home, Castel Gandolfo. The Vatican is opening the public to rooms where Popes Pius XII and Paul VI died. I'm Wyatt Goolsby with your EWTN News Link. Join us this evening for EWTN News Nightly.
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.
This is Open Line on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. If you have a question or comment, call 1-800-585-9396. Outside North America, call 1-205-271-2985 or send an email to openline@ewtn.com.
Okay, well, if you're listening to Open Line now, you might as well stay listening to your radio for the rest of the afternoon. We have a great lineup as usual. On Cresta in the afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern, we have Marcia Williamson, Finding Dante in the Writings of C.S. Lewis. That sounds actually fairly fascinating. I would have never thought you could find Dante in the writings of C.S. Lewis. So I'll probably tune into that myself. And Jack Mulder, also on Cresta, What Does It Mean to Be Catholic? So sounds like a couple of great topics. And then on Catholic Answers Live at 6 p.m. Eastern Time with host Don Johnson, Father Philip Bukansky speaking of a subject we were just talking about, ministering to those with same-sex attraction. So the Church's love for such people obliges us to minister to them and help them to find peace, morally as well as personally and otherwise. So I'd say tune in to Father Philip at 6 p.m. Eastern Time and Catholic Answers Live. Well, let's go to another caller, and we have Andrew in Houston, Texas, listening on 1430 a.m. Good afternoon, Andrew.
Hey, how's it going? I just wanted to speak on why hasn't not necessarily the church, but the church here in the States followed more of a Pope Francis style of Catholicism, which I put it as more as Latin version of Catholicism, because 70% of my friends, I'm a millennial, have left the church completely or went to another religion. I'm one of the few that came back, and I see both sides. Half of my family's Latin, half of my family's white. And the Latin side focuses more on the poor, maybe because an oppression, because maybe they come from that. And they focus a lot on that, you know, and when you go to these Latin masses, they're always packed. The culture is very thick. But in that, you see variety. You see people that are gay, well, they don't say they're gay, but you know they're gay. Gang members, drug addicts. Everyone's accepted because, you know, instead of focusing what the U.S. Catholicism does, focuses too much on society or why the church is, why people are leaving to abortion or whatever, instead of looking inward and saying, what can we do different? And I think that's what Pope Francis is trying to bring from all these U.S. Catholics leaving, because something is not working And I'm not saying that the doctrine needs to change, but maybe a different form of Catholicism, which is Latin, which is very different from the U.S.
Well, I think there's a certain accuracy in that, and I think providentially, if you're looking at why Pope Francis was elected, it is a slightly different mindset. I think part of it is, we Northern European types, deriving from countries in the frozen north, maybe over-intellectualize the faith, and the Pope has criticized that on times. That there is a tendency to do that. It means we've gotten a lot of our great theologians, or even today our great apologists in that, are people who have studied the faith, and what is being taught is true. But there is a sort of ineffable human quality in the Latin practice of the faith. And of course, the church is anchored in that practice in the sense that you say that, that in a way, the Italians also have that temperament, somewhat at least, maybe not quite like the Latin Americans. And there is a greater tolerance for human weakness in that, I think. And I think maybe this is what the Pope is talking about, and why in this year of mercy, he talks about, as I did earlier with a caller, about accompaniment. That we can't, it's to hold the truth is one thing, and to teach it, as we must, but not to make that a condition for a participation in the life of the church. Now, as both Pope Francis has said, and as Pope John Paul II said, in dealing with these issues, none of these issues, being a gang member, being gay, anything like this, is a condition for going to Mass. Now, being in the state of grace is a condition for going to Holy Communion, however, so it's not like those kinds of things that you're doing outside of the church are not important, whether it's, sexually active in a relationship which is not a valid marriage. There is a question mark there, and that has to be resolved. And so, but just to come to church and to get closer to God, that's the beginning of resolving it. To be accompanied in that, recognizing, everybody's weaknesses. One person's may be that they're gay. Some guy may have a secret pornography issue that he's fighting. Or someone else doesn't know how to get out of a business relationship where they feel they're entangled in doing things which are a little shady, or there's all kinds of reasons people can feel and ought to feel a little grubby coming to church. Certainly we should feel grubby enough to go to confession as well. But the toleration for human weakness, I think, sometimes is lacking when we intellectualize the faith strongly. We need a strong intellectual faith because the truth is truth, and everything is measured against that standard. That which is true and that which is good is the standard of not only religion but also of morality, and that has to be known. But people don't always know it, and they need to be led by the hand sometimes, and maybe they need a kick in the pants other times so that they can know it. But that's not going to happen if they're not coming to church. And I think what the Pope is saying is not that we're a big tent where, you can have a homosexual marriage, or you can have this, or you can have that, and still everything's right and good. He's not saying that. But he is definitely saying that come to the church. We're a mother. We want to, to bring you in. Yes, we want to help bind your wounds. Yes, we want to fill your mind with truths rather than errors. But we can't do that unless you first come. So come to your mother. And I think there is certainly a real sense in which I think Latins have a more openness in that respect, perhaps, than we Northern European types. And I think in that respect you've hit upon something. And that's not a question of being liberal or conservative. Because after all, a saint, if you take the holiest people, the saints are able to bring the two together, truth and mercy, justice and love. That's what God is. That's what Jesus is. That's our object, but sometimes we do separate them. We separate the truth like it's an opponent of mercy, justice, that it's against love, and you can't have both. We should be striving for both, and that's how we will bind up the wounded and heal the sick, and the saints have even done that miraculously. So, but we're talking spiritually, and I think in that we can learn from the Latins, we can learn from this Pope. Well, let's go to another questioner. We've got Mike in Southern Illinois listening on Covenant Radio. Good afternoon, Mike.
Mr. Donovan, thank you for taking my call.
You're welcome.
Can you hear me okay, or do I need to get off the speakerphone?
No, you're fine. I can hear you. As long as we don't get any feedback.
Okay. I have kind of a two-part question for you, and if you do good enough on the first one, I won't have the second one.
Okay. What a challenge. Okay, go ahead. Give it to me.
I have, and I've been hearing regularly what I believe to be are unsupported assertions that I have an obligation to vote.
Mm-hmm.
And I hear that from bishops and people on EWTN. It's up and down the spectrum. Can you convince me that I have a moral obligation to vote?
Okay. I will try, and we also have all this same information on our voting website at EWTN.com/vote. So you can go and you can see the logic of that argument by wading through it. There's a lot of it there, but you can pick and choose which sections of that voting website you want to look at. Okay, here is the logic. The Catechism tells us, as does the whole tradition, and we don't want to do this one thing, which sometimes is done with regard to questions like this and others voting. We cannot speak as if the requirements of voting sort of parachuted in on us through one pope or one individual. There is a moral tradition on this. That tradition reflects the common theology of the Church. The common theology is the common theology because all moral theologians teach the same thing, and Pope Pius IX and other popes have spoken of this common theology as representative of the faith's ordinary and universal magisterium, and we must take it seriously. Here is what our common theology teaches us in authors unrelated to this election. In fact, they are long dead. And that is that the purpose of voting and the purpose of our own civic responsibilities, especially in a democracy where we intimately have the opportunity to cooperate with politicians in doing them, is to advance the common good. The common good is told by the Catechism, and also by Pope Benedict did this by giving some terminology to it a little bit. The Catechism tells us that the first element of the common good is the natural rights, natural human rights. What are those? First of all, the right to life, obviously. You cannot have any other rights if you don't have the right to life. Secondly, the right to a family and to be raised in a family. And a family is a natural family formed by the marriage of a man and woman. Other kinds of families, although they may serve in particular situations, like the orphan who ends up with an aunt and uncle or ends up in a foster home, those you don't design those into the system. They are the fallback positions when you can do nothing else. And being raised in a natural family, this is what Benedict would go on to call in 2006 a non-negotiable right, as is the right to life. And the third is the conscience right, specifically with respect to religious freedom, because without the right to live your religious freedom, and here religion must coincide with the natural moral law. You couldn't say you have religious freedom to have human sacrifice, for example, because you can't have religion about an intrinsic evil. It would be false. So right there you have a limitation on religious freedom, the natural moral law. The Church coincides with the natural moral law, and therefore the religious freedom we ask is simply to live according to that natural moral law and to propagate that to our children and so on. And to deprive us of that is deprive us of a basic human right. So those become the non-negotiable common goods. Now there are other common goods. There are goods such as the church says we have a right to basic health care. Every society is going to provide that differently. Every society is structured differently, economically, tax-wise, and other things. That can't be made an essential good because it's subject to negotiation. It's subject to the political will, what's possible, what's available, how to go about it, the best means, and people can have different opinions about those means. And so those are not non-negotiables. Those are negotiables. War and peace, the issues of how to go about educating of children, provided you're respecting the rights of the parents as the primary educators, that's a negotiable item. And you go down the other kinds of policy issues that involve the application of multiple moral principles and involve themselves, actually, historically, multiple historical circumstances, conditions of societies, and so on. There you develop the means that achieve the policy goal that you want. So they can't be the subject of non-negotiability, except the basic thing that you deserve basic health care, and that's your starting point. Or you deserve peace and security, and that's your starting point. But life is a yes-no situation. Marriage is a yes-no situation. Freedom is a yes-no situation. Those are non-negotiable. Now, the tradition says, well, what do you do? Who do you vote for? It does say there is a duty to vote, but in terms of assigning sin, the authors who speak of that, they say that, well, there is at least venial sin involved in not voting against a candidate who is unworthy. So if you have two candidates, one of whom is unworthy, and it becomes clear what is meant there as I go on here, one of whom is unworthy, there is at least a venial obligation, a slight obligation, to vote against the unworthy candidate so that he or she is not elected. They then go on to say, however, if the candidate is an enemy of religion, freedom, and morality, there is a serious obligation. So, religion, freedom, morality, these are language used mid-20th century and earlier to speak in generalities of the natural moral rights, the things which Ratzinger calls the non-negotiables. So what it is saying is if a candidate is the enemy of religion, freedom, and morality, or as Papa Ratzinger said, the non-negotiables, there is a serious obligation to prevent them from getting into office. And so in such a case, that serious obligation is to vote for a worthy candidate. Now here's the thing. The tradition also says you may not vote for an unworthy candidate. So you could not vote for an enemy of religion, freedom, and morality, except to exclude a worst candidate. So if you have an obligation to vote when there is a candidate who is an enemy of religion, freedom, and morality, and you can even vote for a candidate who is less an enemy of religion, freedom, and morality, and this is all under serious obligation, the conclusion has to be that one must vote for the candidate who will limit what you could expect from the more extreme candidate, even though they themselves are imperfect on the non-negotiable items. In other words, to serve the common good is not served by a vote where I come out and I feel like I'm clean because I voted for the pure pro-life candidate, or I don't go to vote because all of these people are repugnant. No, if the purpose is the common good, and the common good is in danger, and the common good, especially on these higher points of the non-negotiables, is in danger, we can have a serious obligation to exclude the worst of those candidates. And the good we are voting for is not the position of the less bad candidate, but the difference between what the one would do and what we could exclude by voting for the less, slightly less, more, however you wish to define that, or perhaps even a worthy candidate if such is there. There is yet one other aspect of this. Everything in morality is governed by prudence. If we don't do due diligence and take into account the foreseeable results, consequences of our voting or not voting, we share in the culpability of the election of a person who does damage to religion, freedom, and morals, whom we failed to do what was foreseeably possible to prevent their election, or at least limit the damage that they might have done by not electing them, even though another individual might also do damage. The principle there is the principle of double effect, and that is you're voting for the good of limiting the damage of the worst candidate who might get elected by voting for the less worst candidate without embracing any evils that they themselves may have in their policies, without embracing their means to achieve any of those things, because you have a proportionate reason of excluding somebody who is very bad on life with someone who is less bad on life, who is very bad on marriage with somebody who is less bad in marriage, who is very bad on religious freedom, who is less bad. And it is that less bad which is the good, or you could say the difference between the two, which is the good that you're voting for, even though you know you're not going to be happy with the outcome. But you certainly not would be happy with the outcome of the worst candidate. That's the logic of the moral tradition. And it's even contained in what is sometimes used, I think, to perhaps against even the reputation of then Cardinal Ratzinger, who said it, that, well, you can find a proportionate reason to vote for a person, and the language I use is who has a good basket of negotiables, even though they're horrible on the non-negotiables. What would ever be a good basket of negotiables to vote for somebody who is anti-life, anti-marriage, and anti-religious freedom? Could you say, well, I'm thinking of the 1930s. For the sake of a good economy, we elected somebody who's going to round up all of the drains on the economy and get rid of them. No, you wouldn't do that. You would say, no, that's morally wrong. Well, if it's obvious in the extreme, it's certainly obvious in a single case. Is it right to tolerate the killing of one so that, many can have health benefits or something like that? There's no proportion there. And Cardinal Ratzinger used the term proportion. And that term didn't parachute into his statement. It came out of the moral tradition. And it's clear there is no proportionality between the non-negotiables and the negotiables, as he says in the very same thing. But where the tradition says you can vote for a candidate who's bad on the non-negotiables is to exclude a worse candidate on the non-negotiables. And that is the proportional exception on the categorically same level, life, marriage, and freedom of conscience, that Cardinal Ratzinger is referring to, and which is clearly in the moral theology tradition going back into the past. And I think we can trust the theologian who invented the expression or coined the term hermeneutic of continuity that his statement was in continuity with the tradition and not an authorization to vote for pro-abortion, pro-gay marriage, and pro-restrict religious freedom candidates because they're good on wages or some other negotiable issue of the common good. No, that's simply not consistent with the tradition. The tradition gives us the one example to exclude a worse candidate. So I don't know if I convinced you, Mike. I know that was long-winded, but there's actually a lot of moral theology in that and a lot of history to convey, and that's the logic by which I think you get to that conclusion. Do you have a follow-up?
I think so, because I think I agree with everything you said there in the context of a single election and it's a single point of time. I look at my lifetime where I have voted in every single election up to this point, and there's the option of not voting, and they will know that I don't vote because when they go to look at registrations, they will see that I voted for I pulled a particular party's ballot in every single primary, and I voted in every single general election, and when they see the box for 2016, they will see no vote in the general election.
Who's they, and how will that change history?
That when they aggregate those of us who are so disgusted and doubt whether or not the system really even works anymore.
Yeah. So you're prepared to allow damage to the common good to be done until they get it, you know. You made the point yourself that all the times you voted, you know what the consequences have been, and we've had trouble turning this ship around, you know, and now we're like the Titanic. Our stern is up in the air. I don't think there's any time left. I think we've struck the iceberg about 30, 40, 50 years ago with Roe v. Wade, actually, and in the church it's the dissent on Humanae Vitae. We struck the iceberg. Our stern we took on water. Our stern is up in the air. The next thing is the freezing cold water, and I don't think we have that time left. I really don't. But anyway, the moral tradition, I think, and the virtue of prudence, if you read St. Thomas in the Summa on the 8 elements of a virtuous act, a prudent act, you will see that I think there's little fiddle room there for not taking the bull by the horns and making a conscientious decision according to church teaching and making the best decision you can in the circumstances with the common good here and now and not potentially in the future as your object. And that's what I would propose. Well, let's see. I don't know if we have time to take another caller. Maybe a quick question here. I'll just read it off the prompter. Dave in Lafayette asking, can a gay man have a Christian funeral mass? Absolutely. I mean, typically what happens is if somebody is in a parish, they're known to the pastor, or their family brings them and wants to have them married or have a funeral mass, that they're going to get the funeral mass. The church is not asking that question. The question might come up, however, in terms of scandal if they're living an active homosexual life, and that's well known. There might be an issue. Otherwise, simply having homosexual orientation would not be the reason to exclude somebody from a Christian funeral. Well, good questions today, and looking forward to taking more next week at this time. Hope you'll come back, and you'll tune in Monday as well for John Martinoni and the rest of our Open Line lineup next week. Until next week, God bless and have a great weekend. I'm Colin Donovan, and this has been the Friday edition of Open Line.